Cold rain fell over Maple Creek, Iowa, the kind that soaks through denim in seconds, the kind that turns a gravel driveway into a river of mud. Walter Hayes, 74 years old, had just finished feeding his animals. Same routine he'd followed for 40 years. Same boots, same rusted bucket, same quiet. His old Ford pickup sat parked by the barn engine, still ticking from the drive back from the feed store. That truck was older than some of his neighbors' children. Dented door, cracked windshield. But it was his. Nearly everything he had left in the world sat inside that cab: his father's pocketknife in the glove box, his late wife's rosary hanging from the mirror. He turned toward the house. That's when he heard it. The engine roared to life behind him. Walter spun around just in time to see his own truck fishtail out of the driveway, headlights slicing through the rain gravel, spraying against the barn wall. A teenage boy was behind the wheel. Walter didn't run, didn't shout, didn't even set down the bucket in his hand. He just stood there in the rain, watching his truck disappear down the county road, taillights shrinking into red pinpricks, and then nothing at all. 20 minutes later, the phone rang. It was Sheriff Doug Pruitt. Walter had known him since they were boys, fishing the same creek. "Walter," Doug said, and something in his voice made Walter's chest go tight. "Truck's been in an accident. Missed the curve out on County Road 9. Boy's hurt pretty bad." Walter didn't ask about the truck. "Is he alive?" "Yeah, banged up. Broken arm, some cuts. They're bringing him to the clinic now." Walter grabbed his coat off the hook by the door. By the time he reached town, half of Maple Creek already knew. News moves fast in a place with one stoplight and one diner. People stood outside the hardware store, arms crossed, waiting to see what Walter would do. Waiting for him to press charges. Waiting for the boy, some troubled kid nobody claimed to really know, to finally get what was coming to him. Instead, Walter walked past the sheriff's cruiser, past the small crowd gathering under the awning, and into Higgins' convenience store. He moved slowly down the narrow aisles. A turkey sandwich wrapped in plastic, a bottle of water, a small box of pain relievers from the shelf behind the counter. He set them on the counter and reached for his wallet. Old cracked leather. Inside, folded soft from years of use, was every dollar he had left until his next check. "That'll be $40.12, the cashier said, eyeing him carefully. Everyone in that store knew exactly whose truck had just been totaled 2 miles outside of town. Walter counted out every bill without a word, handed it over, took the small paper bag. Sheriff Pruitt was waiting for him outside, rain dripping off the brim of his hat, watching Walter with the kind of look you give a man you're afraid might be losing his mind. "Walter," he said carefully, "you do know that's the boy who stole your truck." Walter looked down at this bag in his hands, then out at the rain falling over the town that had already decided what kind of man he was and what kind of boy that kid would always be. "Maybe," Walter said quietly, "but tonight he's just a hungry kid with nobody waiting for him." He walked toward the clinic without looking back. Nobody in Maple Creek understood what they had just witnessed. Not yet. To understand why Walter Hayes handed $40 to the boy who stole his truck, you have to understand who Walter Hayes was. Not who people said he was, who he actually was. Maple Creek was the kind of town where everybody knew everybody's business, whether it was true or not. And for the last decade, the story people told about Walter Hayes was simple. The old man had gone soft. He'd farmed the same 200 acres his whole life. Corn, soybeans, a handful of cattle he talked to more than most people. His wife Margaret had died 11 years ago, cancer, quick and cruel, and Walter had never remarried, never even looked at another woman. He lived alone in the white farmhouse at the end of Route 6, same house Margaret had planted her rose bushes outside of roses. Walter still watered every morning, even though half the town thought that was strange too. Before the farm, Walter had been a Marine. 2 tours. He didn't talk about it. Not once, not to anyone, not even to Margaret in 41 years of marriage. All anybody really knew was that Walter Hayes had come home from that war quieter than he left, and he'd stayed that way ever since. He was honest to a fault. If a neighbor's fence line was 6 inches onto his property, Walter would rather move his own fence than start an argument. If someone owed him money, he'd wait years before mentioning it, and even then only if they brought it up first. He never asked anyone for help. Not when his hips started giving him trouble. Not when the tractor broke down during harvest and he fixed it himself in the dark with a flashlight in his teeth. Not when the house got too quiet at night. But somewhere along the way, Walter's kindness had curdled in the town's eyes into foolishness. It started 3 years back when he'd let a family stay in his old hunting cabin rent-free for a whole winter after their trailer burned down. Then it was the checks he quietly wrote to the church food pantry, checks nobody was supposed to know about, but everybody did anyway because Maple Creek couldn't keep a secret if its life depended on it. Then it was the hitchhikers he'd pick up on the county road, the strangers he'd buy a meal for at the diner, the drifters he'd let sleep in his barn on the coldest nights of the year. "He'll get robbed one of these days," people said at the feed store. "He'll get himself killed helping the wrong person," they said at church. "He's a good man," old Pastor Mullins would say, "but he doesn't know how to say no." Walter heard every word of it. Maple Creek wasn't big enough for whispers to stay whispers, but he never argued, never defended himself. He'd just nod, pay for his feed, and drive home to his empty house in his roses and his quiet. Some men get bitter with age. Walter had gone the other way, softer, slower to judge, as if every year that passed made him more certain that everybody deserved one more chance than the world was willing to give them. Which is how on a gray Tuesday morning, 6 months before his truck went sailing down County Road 9, Walter found himself standing in the parking lot of the Cedar County Juvenile Detention Center, 45 minutes from his farm for reasons he couldn't fully explain, even to himself. He was there because of a boy named Eli Ramsey. Eli was 17 years old, and by the time most people in the county had heard his name, it was already attached to a police report. 3 arrests before he turned 16, shoplifting, vandalism, a stolen car that wasn't the first one he'd taken for a joyride, just the first one he'd gotten caught in. There were whispers of drugs too, the kind of whispers that, in a small town, become accepted as fact, whether they're proven or not. His mother had left when he was 6. His father was in and out of prison more than he was in and out of Eli's life. And by the time Eli turned 14, he was effectively raising himself in a falling-down rental on the edge of town, bouncing between relatives who didn't want him and a system that had run out of patience for him. Teachers described him as sharp, too sharp, maybe sharp enough to know exactly how far he could push before anyone stopped him. Neighbors described him as trouble. The county described him in the flat language of case files as a high-risk juvenile with limited family support and a documented pattern of escalating offenses. Nobody described him as a kid worth saving. Not out loud anyway. Walter had heard about Eli the way he heard about most things secondhand over coffee, in the kind of tone people used when they were really saying good riddance. Something about the boy's story had lodged itself in Walter's chest and refused to let go. Maybe it was the age. 17? Maybe it was the fact that nobody, not one person in that boy's entire life, had ever simply shown up for him without wanting something in return. Walter didn't tell anyone where he was going that Tuesday morning. He just got in his truck, drove the 45 minutes to Cedar County, and walked into the visitor's office of a detention center he'd never set foot in before in his life. The woman at the front desk looked up confused. "Can I help you?" "I'd like to see Eli Ramsey," Walter said. "Are you family?" Walter thought about that question longer than the woman expected him to. "No," he finally said. "Just somebody who thought he could use a visitor." The woman studied him for a long moment. The weathered hands, the quiet voice, the kind of steadiness that didn't belong to a man with any agenda at all. Then she picked up the phone. 15 minutes later, a boy with tired eyes and a jaw set hard against the world sat down across from Walter Hayes for the first time. Neither of them had any idea what that meeting would grow into. Eli Ramsey sat down across the metal table like a boy who'd already decided this visit was a waste of his time. Arms crossed, jaw tight, eyes fixed somewhere over Walter's shoulder, refusing to give the old man the satisfaction of eye contact. "Who are you?" he asked, not a greeting, a challenge. "Walter Hayes." "I don't know you." "No," Walter agreed. "You don't." Silence stretched between them. The kind of silence most adults rush to fill, the kind that makes people nervous, makes them start explaining themselves, apologizing, justifying. Walter did none of that. He just sat there, hands folded on the table, calm as a man waiting out a storm he'd seen 100 times before. Eli waited for the lecture, the one about second chances, about turning his life around, about how a boy like him needed to start making better choices. He'd heard versions of that speech from teachers, from caseworkers, from a judge who'd looked at him like he was already a lost cause before he'd even opened his mouth. The lecture never came. Walter checked his watch once. 15 minutes, he told the front desk. 15 minutes and not a second more. Well, Eli finally said, "You gonna say something or just sit there?" "Didn't come here to talk," Walter said. "Came here to visit." "That's not a thing. Visiting's supposed to have talking in it." Walter almost smiled. Almost. Not always. The 15 minutes passed in near silence. Walter asked nothing about the arrests, nothing about the family. Eli didn't have nothing about what he'd done to land himself behind that door. When the guard came to signal time was up, Walter stood, nodded once, and walked out without another word. Eli sat there afterward, more unsettled by that silence than he'd have been by any lecture in the world. The next Saturday, Walter came back. Eli didn't expect it. Told himself he didn't care either way. But when the guard called his name that second Saturday morning, something in his chest moved before his mind caught up to it. Walter sat down across from him again. Same weathered flannel. Same steady quiet. "Thought maybe you wouldn't come back," Eli said, working hard to sound like it didn't matter. "Said I would. People say a lot of things. I don't." 15 minutes, no lectures, no gifts, no candy bars smuggled in, no cash slipped across the table the way some visitors tried and failed to do. No pity in Walter's eyes, the kind of pity Eli had learned to hate more than anger, more than judgment. Just an old farmer sitting across from a boy the world had already written off, giving him exactly what nobody else had ever bothered to give him: his time. Week after week, Walter kept coming, every Saturday like clockwork. Rain or shine, whether the roads were good, or whether he had to drive 45 minutes through sleet to make it. He never missed once. Eli started noticing things about the visits he couldn't explain even to himself. The way he found himself watching the clock on Saturday mornings waiting. The way he stopped himself mid-argument with a guard or another kid because some part of him didn't want Walter hearing about it later. The way the silence between them, once uncomfortable, had started to feel like something closer to peace. Weeks turned into a month. The other boys in the facility noticed too. "Who's the old man?" one of them asked. "Nobody," Eli said too fast. "He comes every Saturday for nobody." Eli didn't have an answer for that. By the sixth visit, something had shifted enough that Eli stopped performing the tough kid silence he wore like armor for everyone else. He started talking small things at first. The food was terrible. His cellmate snored like a chainsaw. A book he'd been reading from the facility's sad little library, the only thing in there worth a damn. Walter listened to all of it, asked a question here and there, never pushed further than Eli was willing to go. Then on the seventh Saturday, Eli finally asked the question that had been building in him for weeks. "Why do you keep coming here?" Walter looked at him for a long moment. Not with pity, not with the careful clinical concern of a social worker filling out paperwork. Something else, something that looked almost like recognition. "Because somebody once showed up for me," Walter said, "when I didn't deserve it, when nobody thought I did." Eli sat with that. "What did you do?" Walter's jaw tightened just slightly. The first crack Eli had seen in that steady calm. "That's a story for another day." "Why not today?" "Because you're not ready to hear it, and truth is," Walter added, standing as the guard signaled time was up, "I'm not sure I'm ready to tell it." He left Eli sitting there with more questions than he'd walked in with. Over the following weeks, that question followed Eli everywhere. Late at night in his bunk, staring at the ceiling. During the long, empty hours of the facility's routine, he found himself turning it over and over. What had happened to Walter Hayes all those years ago that turned an old farmer into a man who drove 90 minutes round trip every Saturday to sit in silence with a kid nobody else wanted? The other kids had given up trying to figure Walter out. Some assumed he was some kind of church volunteer doing his good deed for the week. Others figured he had a grandson who died or a son in prison somewhere, and Eli was some kind of substitute. Eli didn't believe any of it. There was something specific in the way Walter looked at him, not like a stranger doing charity work, but like a man looking at a mirror held up to his own past. By the 10th Saturday, Eli had stopped pretending he didn't care whether Walter showed up. By the 12th, he'd started counting down the days. And on a cold morning in late February, sitting across from the old farmer, who'd never once raised his voice, never once judged him, never once treated him like a lost cause, Eli asked the question one more time. "Tell me," he said quietly. Please." This time Walter didn't deflect. He looked down at his hands that had built fences, buried a wife, held a rifle in a war he never talked about, and for the first time in 50 years, Walter Hayes began to tell someone the truth about who he used to be. "I was 16. Walter began, and I hated the whole world." Eli didn't move, didn't say a word. For the first time since they'd started meeting, it was Walter who needed the silence to hold. "My father drank," Walter said. "Bad. The kind of drinking that turns a house into a place you're afraid to walk into. My mother left when I was 12, and I never blamed her for it, not once. Though I spent a long time being angry, she didn't take me with her." He looked past Eli, past the cinder block walls of the visiting room, back 58 years to a version of himself that had been buried so deep so long that speaking it out loud felt like exhuming a body. "By 16, I was angry all the time. Didn't matter at what. Angry that my mother left. Angry at my father for giving her a reason to. Angry that I couldn't afford new boots. Angry that the other kids at school had families that looked like something out of a magazine, while mine looked like a house on fire that everybody just kept walking past." "So you got in trouble," Eli said. Not a question, a recognition. "I got in trouble," Walter confirmed. "Fighting mostly at first, then stealing. Small things, cigarettes from the drugstore, money out of the collection plate at church. God forgive me. Then bigger things. I broke into the hardware store on Route 6, same road my farm sits on now, if you can believe that, and I took every tool I could carry. Wasn't even planning to sell them. Didn't need them. I think I just wanted to take something from somebody. The way I felt like the world had taken everything from me. What happened? Sheriff caught me 2 blocks away. I was 16 years old with a bag of stolen tools and a rap sheet that already had my name on it twice before. Everybody in town had already made up their mind about who I was going to become. My own father barely looked at me when they brought me home that night. Just shook his head like I'd confirmed something he'd known all along. Walter's hands resting on the table curled slightly. I was looking at real time. Juvenile detention may be worse if the judge wanted to make an example. And truth be told, Eli, I don't think anybody in that town would have argued with it. I was the boy nobody wanted. Same as you. Eli said nothing, but something in his face had opened just slightly. There was a man, Walter continued, named Raymond Whitfield. Everybody called him Mr. Raymond. He was the principal at the high school old near retirement, the kind of man who'd been teaching and running that building since before my own father went there. I'd never had much to do with him beyond getting sent to his office for fighting. He had no reason in this world to care what happened to me. But he did. He showed up at the courthouse the morning of my hearing. Nobody had asked him to. He wasn't family, wasn't required to be there. He just came, sat in the back of that courtroom in his good Sunday suit, and when the judge asked if anyone wanted to speak on my behalf, Mr. Raymond stood up. Walter's voice had gone quiet the way a man's voice goes quiet when he's walking carefully around something fragile. He told the judge I'd been late to school 43 times that year, and he knew because he'd checked the boiler room and found me sleeping there some mornings rather than going home. He told the judge he'd never once seen me start a fight. I didn't finish trying to protect somebody smaller than me. And then he said something I've never forgotten, not one day since. Eli leaned forward. What did he say? He looked right at that judge and he said, "A mistake is something you did not, someone you are." Then he told the court he had a job opening at the school. Groundskeeping, filing. Odd work, nothing glamorous. And he said if the court would give me the chance, he'd take responsibility for me himself. The room had gone very still. The judge gave me a choice, Walter said. Detention or supervised release, working for Mr. Raymond, after school, every day, 6 months, minimum 1 violation, and I was gone. I took the job. Did it work? Walter allowed himself something close to a smile, the first one Eli had seen from him in 7 weeks of Saturdays. Not right away. I was ugly to him the first few weeks. Showed up late on purpose. Did sloppy work just to see if he'd give up on me the way everybody else had. He never did. Never raised his voice at me either, not once in all the months I worked for that man. When I did something wrong, he just told me plainly, fixed it, and expected better the next day. No lectures, no pity, just work and the quiet expectation that I was capable of more than I believed about myself. What happened to him? He died when I was 23. Heart attack sudden in his sleep. I was already married to Margaret by then, already working this land. I went to his funeral and stood in the back, same way he'd stood in the back of that courtroom for me, and I made myself a promise standing over his casket. What promise? Walter looked directly at Eli then, and for the first time the boy understood exactly why this old man had been showing up every Saturday for 2 months straight. I promised I'd spend the rest of my life paying that debt forward. Not to him, he was already gone. There was no repaying him directly. But to whoever needed it next. Whoever the world had already written off. Whoever needed one person to look at them and see something worth saving instead of something worth discarding. Eli sat back slowly, the weight of it settling over him. That's why you keep coming here. That's why I keep coming here. You could have picked anybody, any kid in this county. Why me? Walter was quiet for a long moment. Because when I read about what happened with you, the arrest, the family that gave up on you, the way this whole county already decided who you were going to be, I saw a boy nobody was willing to show up for. And I made a promise 50 years ago that I'd be the man who shows up. Eli's throat tightened. He looked down at the table at his own hands, rough already from a life that had never once been gentle with him. I've been repaying that debt ever since, Walter said quietly. Every person I've ever helped in this town, and there's been more than you'd guess, every one of them, was really me trying to become the kind of man Raymond Whitfield believed I already was. The guard's voice cut through the visiting room, signaling time was up. Walter stood the way he always did, steady and unhurried. But before he left, he paused at the door and looked back at Eli one last time. A mistake is something you did, Walter said, not someone you are. You remember that whatever happens next. He walked out into the gray Iowa afternoon, leaving behind a boy who, for the first time in longer than he could remember, felt something dangerously close to hope. Eli Ramsey walked out of the Cedar County Juvenile Detention Center on a Thursday morning in early April, 6 months to the day after his intake, with nothing but a garbage bag of clothes and a released offender pamphlet nobody would ever read. There was no family waiting in the parking lot, no mother, no father, no grandmother with open arms. That had never been part of Eli's story, and he'd long since stopped expecting it to be. Walter Hayes was there instead, leaning against his truck, not the one that had crashed months later, but the older one before it, the one he'd been driving for going on 15 years. He didn't say much, just nodded when Eli walked out, took the garbage bag from him, and set it in the truck bed like it was luggage instead of the sum total of a boy's life. Where am I going? Eli asked, climbing into the passenger seat. My place, Walter said. Got a room in the back, used to be for storage, cleared it out. You're just taking me in just like that? Walter pulled out of the parking lot, hands steady on the wheel. Not taking you in, giving you a job. There's a difference. What kind of job? Farm work. Fences need mending. Barn needs cleaning. Cattle don't feed themselves. Eli studied the old man's profile, waiting for the catch, the condition the moment this arrangement revealed its price. He'd learned the hard way that nothing came free, that every kindness eventually asked for something back. Why would you trust me with any of that? Walter's answer came without hesitation. I don't, not yet. Trust isn't something I'm handing you, Eli. It's something you're going to earn, same as I had to earn Mr. Raymond's one honest day at a time. That honesty landed harder than any reassurance could have. Walter laid out the rules that first night, sitting across from Eli at a kitchen table that had seen 41 years of Margaret's cooking and 11 years of silence since. There weren't many rules, and none of them were complicated. Be honest, work hard, show up. That's it, Eli asked. That's it. Everything else takes care of itself if you keep those three. The work started the next morning before the sun was even up. Walter woke Eli at 5:30 with 2 cups of black coffee and a list of chores that would have exhausted a grown man twice Eli's age. Mending fence line along the north pasture where winter frost had heaved the posts loose from the ground. Mucking out the barn stalls, a job that made Eli's eyes water the first week and that he eventually stopped noticing at all. Learning to drive the old tractor, stalling it out in the mud a dozen times before Walter, patient as stone, showed him the trick to easing off the clutch. It was hard. Harder than anything Eli had ever done, harder even than the discipline of detention, because this kind of hard came without walls forcing you to stay. Eli could have walked away any morning. Nobody would have chased him. Walter never once locked a door or raised his voice or threatened consequences if Eli decided the farm wasn't for him. That was exactly what kept him there. Nobody had ever given Eli the choice to stay before. Every other structure in his life had been imposed on him: foster placements, detention court orders. This was the first time anyone had simply handed him freedom and trusted him against all evidence to choose the harder, better thing. The days fell into a rhythm. Up before dawn, coffee on the porch watching the sun climb over frost-covered fields while Walter talked sparingly about the work ahead. Long hours of labor that left Eli's hands blistered and then slowly calloused and strong. Dinner in near silence most nights, though the silence had none of the discomfort it once carried in that visiting room. It had become something closer to companionship. Walter never asked about Eli's past beyond what Eli offered freely, never brought up the arrests, the drugs, the mother who left, or the father who couldn't stay out of prison long enough to matter. He simply worked alongside him day after day, treating Eli exactly the way he treated the land, with patience, with steady attention, and with the quiet certainty that something worthwhile would grow there, given enough time. Slowly, without either of them quite marking the moment it happened, the relationship began to shift. It started with small things. Eli noticed Walter's hip bothering him on cold mornings and started taking on the heavier lifting without being asked. Walter noticed Eli staying up late some nights reading worn paperbacks from a box in the hall closet Margaret had once kept for herself, and started leaving new ones on the kitchen table without comment. Neither of them named what was happening. But by June, 2 months in, Eli had stopped thinking of the farmhouse as somewhere he was staying and started thinking of it as somewhere he lived. There was an evening in early June that Eli would remember for the rest of his life, though nothing dramatic happened in it. They were sitting on the porch after a long day, fixing fence, watching the sun go down over the western fields, and Walter had handed him a glass of lemonade without a word. "You ever think about after?" Eli asked. "Like what happens to me when this is done? What makes you think it's ever going to be done?" Eli didn't have an answer for that. Nobody had ever suggested to him that any arrangement in his life might simply continue uninterrupted, without an expiration date attached. "I mean it, Eli," Walter said, looking out at the fields instead of at the boy beside him, the way he did when the words mattered too much for eye contact. "You're not a project I'm finishing. You're not a case file closing out. If you want to stay, you stay. Long as you're honest, work hard, and show up same as anybody." Something in Eli's chest, some old and permanent ache he'd carried since he was 6 years old, watching his mother's car disappear down the street, loosened just slightly that evening. For the first time, he let himself imagine a future that included this porch, these fields, this quiet old man who had somehow become, without either of them planning it, the closest thing to family Eli had ever known. He started calling him Walter less and less, and something closer to Sir more and more, not out of formality, but out of a respect he'd never felt for anyone in his life. Walter never corrected him, never pushed for anything more sentimental than that. Then in the third week of June, Eli did something Walter never asked him to do and never even knew about until much later. 2 years earlier, before any of the arrests that had defined his file, 15-year-old Eli had shoplifted from Deacon's Grocery on Main Street cigarettes and cash from an unlocked register drawer while the owner's back was turned, a total of $63 that Eli had spent within a week and never thought about again. He thought about it now. On a Tuesday afternoon, with money he'd earned from his first month working the farm, money Walter had insisted on paying him over Eli's protests, that he owed the old man far more than any wage could cover. Eli drove Walter's spare truck into town, walked into Deacon's Grocery, and set $63 on the counter in front of a startled Mr. Deacon. "What's this for?" the old shopkeeper asked. "2 years ago, I stole this from you. Cash and cigarettes. I'm paying it back." Mr. Deacon looked at the boy standing in front of him, the same boy half the town still whispered about, the same boy the sheriff's report had once described in language that made him sound less like a person and more like a problem, and something in his expression softened. "You didn't have to do this, son." "Yeah," Eli said quietly. "I did." He drove back to the farm that evening and never mentioned it to Walter, not that day, not for months afterward. It wasn't done for credit. It wasn't done to prove anything to anyone watching. It was the first thing in Eli Ramsey's life that he had ever made right simply because it was right to do. Somewhere, without either of them fully realizing it, yet the debt Walter Hayes had spent 50 years repaying had begun quietly to pass forward. The tornado came on a Thursday night in late July, the kind of night that started ordinary and ended as the worst of Walter Hayes' life. There had been warnings on the radio all afternoon, severe thunderstorm watches, the usual summer static that Iowa farmers learned to live with and mostly ignore. Walter and Eli had spent the day repairing the last stretch of fence line on the south pasture, exhausted and sunburned, and they'd eaten a quiet dinner as the sky outside the kitchen window turned a color neither of them had seen before. Green, black, heavy wrong. The siren started just after 9. "Storm cellar," Walter said, already moving, voice calm but urgent in a way Eli had never heard from him. Now. They made it into the old cellar behind the farmhouse with less than 4 minutes to spare. What followed was a sound Eli would carry with him for the rest of his life, a roar that didn't sound like weather at all, more like something alive and furious tearing the world apart above their heads. Eli sat pressed against the cellar wall, and for the first time since he'd arrived at the farm, he watched Walter Hayes look afraid. It lasted less than 90 seconds. It felt like an hour. When they climbed out into the ringing silence afterward, the farm they emerged into bore almost no resemblance to the one they'd left. The barn Walter's grandfather had built with his own hands, the barn that had stood through 80 years of Iowa winters, was gone. Not damaged. Gone, reduced to splintered lumber, scattered across 2 fields. The equipment shed had collapsed in on itself, crushing the tractor Eli had only just learned to drive. Of the 11 head of cattle Walter had spent years building his small herd, from 6 were dead and 2 more were never found. The old truck, the one Walter had driven for 15 years, sat on its side in the ditch where the wind had thrown it like a toy. Walter stood in the wreckage of everything he'd built, and Eli watched something in the old man go very quiet and very still. The days that followed were a slow-motion catastrophe of paperwork and phone calls. The insurance adjuster arrived 3 days later, walked the property with a clipboard and an expression that told Walter everything before he opened his mouth. "Mr. Hayes, I'm sorry to tell you this, but your policy lapsed 8 months ago. There's a letter in our file. It looks like it was sent to this address, but I don't have record of payment or renewal." Walter's jaw tightened. He remembered the letter now, vaguely a piece of mail he'd set aside during the worst weeks of his back trouble the previous winter, meaning to deal with it later, and had simply forgotten in the exhausting rhythm of running a farm alone. One oversight, one letter lost in a stack of others, and now it meant everything. "There's nothing you can do?" Eli asked, standing beside him. The adjuster shook his head. "I truly am sorry. Without insurance, the numbers were impossible. Rebuilding the barn alone would run well over $60,000, money Walter didn't have, had never needed to have, because a lifetime of careful, modest farming had never prepared him for a catastrophe this total. The bank held a small mortgage on the land taken out years earlier for equipment Walter had long since paid down to almost nothing. But almost nothing became something again when the collateral behind it, barn equipment, half the herd, had vanished in 90 seconds. The foreclosure notice arrived 6 weeks later. Word travels fast in a small town, and word of Walter Hayes losing his farm traveled faster than anything Maple Creek had gossiped about in years. And with it came the other conversation, the one running underneath every sympathetic word people offered him at the diner and the feed store and after church. Terrible what happened to Walter. Heard the bank's taking the farm. Well, someone would always say, lowering their voice just enough to seem discreet, "You know, he's had that boy living with him. That Ramsey kid. Wonder how much of his time and money went into that instead of keeping his own affairs in order. If he hadn't wasted his savings on some criminal nobody else wanted, maybe he'd have caught that insurance letter in time. Kindness only gets you so far in this world. We told him. Didn't we tell him?" Eli heard every word of it. Maple Creek had never been subtle, and grief had made the town even less careful about who might be listening. He heard it at Deacon's grocery, where the same shopkeeper he'd repaid $2 at a time now looked at him with something closer to suspicion again. He heard it outside the church from women who'd once brought casseroles to Walter after Margaret died and now brought only whispered blame. Nobody said it directly to Walter's face. Nobody had to. He heard it anyway in the careful way people avoided his eyes now, in the sympathy that came wrapped in unmistakable judgment. The morning he sat at the kitchen table to sign the foreclosure paperwork, Eli stood in the doorway and watched the old man's hand hesitate over the pen. "There's got to be something," Eli said. "A loan, an extension, something." "Bank's been more than patient," Walter said quietly. "I've got nothing left to offer them. This isn't fair." Walter looked up at him then, and something in his weathered face held more resignation than Eli had ever seen from him. "Life doesn't always reward good people, Eli. I learned that a long time before you were born. Doesn't mean you stop being good, just means you stop expecting it to save you." He signed the papers. Eli said nothing more that morning. He couldn't. There was nothing to say that would undo a tornado or an insurance letter forgotten during a hard winter, or a town that had already decided this was the price Walter paid for wasting his kindness on the wrong boy. He went out to what remained of the barn that afternoon and stood alone in the wreckage for a long time. That night, after Walter had gone to bed early, exhausted in a way that went beyond his body, Eli packed a small bag. He left no note. There was nothing he could write that would explain what he was about to do, and even if there had been, some part of him understood that trying to explain it in advance would only give Walter the chance to stop him. He walked out to the road in the dark, the same road his stolen joyride had once ended on, with the sound of shattering glass and a broken arm, and he started walking. Walter woke the next morning to an empty room and a noteless silence that told him everything he feared. He searched the farm first, then called the sheriff, then sat on the porch as the sun rose over fields that no longer had a barn to shade them, and let himself believe in the quiet, devastating way a man believes the worst when he has no evidence to hold against it that Eli Ramsey was gone for good. That the boy he'd given everything to had finally taken the one thing left worth taking a piece of Walter's faith, that any of it had mattered at all. He didn't know not yet where Eli had gone. He didn't know that somewhere on a county road 40 miles away, a boy who had once stolen a truck out of pure rage was now walking on purpose toward every person Walter Hayes had ever quietly helped and never once mentioned. He only knew that his farm was gone, his barn was gone, and now it seemed so was the boy he'd come to love like a grandson. Walter sat alone on that porch for a long time, and for the first time since Margaret's funeral, he let himself weep. Eli Ramsey had no plan when he walked out of the farmhouse that night. Only a name half remembered from something Walter had let slip once over dinner, months earlier, about a man from the fire department who'd once needed help he never asked for. It took Eli 3 days of walking, hitching rides, and asking careful questions at gas stations before he found him, Dale Kessler, a firefighter in the next county, over 48 years old. Broad-shouldered, with the kind of weathered face that came from 20 years of running into buildings other people were running out of. Eli stood on Dale's porch uncertain and simply asked, "Did you know Walter Hayes?" Dale's expression changed instantly. "Walter, course, I know Walter." "Why?" "His farm's being foreclosed. Tornado wrecked the barn and he never got the insurance letter in time. He's losing everything." Dale's jaw tightened and something in his eyes went hard with a resolve Eli hadn't expected. "You'd better come inside," Dale said, "and you'd better tell me everything." Over coffee at Dale's kitchen table, the story came out, not the story Eli had come to tell, but a different one entirely. 15 years earlier, Dale explained he'd been a young volunteer firefighter drowning in debt after his wife's medical bills piled up faster than his department's salary could cover. He'd been 2 months from losing his own house when an anonymous envelope showed up in his mailbox containing $4,000 in cash and a note that read only, "Get back on your feet." No name, no return address. "Took me years to figure out it was Walter," Dale said. "He never admitted it outright, not once, even when I asked him straight to his face. But I knew. Everybody who's ever needed help in this county eventually figures out where it came from, even if he never says a word about it." Eli sat there stunned. "He never told anyone." "Walter doesn't tell anyone anything," Dale said, almost laughing, though there was no humor in it now. "That's exactly the kind of man he is. Now tell me what he needs and let's figure out how to fix it." That was the first name. It would not be the last. Over the following 3 weeks, Eli traveled across 4 counties, sleeping in his backpack, some nights in the spare rooms of strangers, turned allies on others, following a trail of quiet generosity that Walter Hayes had left scattered across decades without ever once expecting a return. He found Ruth Ann Whitmore, a retired school teacher in her 70s, who told him through tears about the year Walter had anonymously paid for her husband's cancer treatment after their insurance had denied the claim money that had bought them 3 more years together before he passed. He found Marcus Bell, a mechanic in his 30s, who'd been 16 and headed down a path frighteningly similar to Eli's own, when Walter, a near stranger at the time, had shown up at his family's door with an offer of farm work. No questions asked, the same offer Eli himself had once received. He found Carla Jimenez, a widow raising 3 children alone after her husband's accident, who described the winter Walter had quietly stocked her family's pantry every week for 4 months, without ever once being asked, without ever once wanting credit. He found a veteran named Frank Doyle, a man who'd once slept in his car outside the VA hospital because he had nowhere else to go, until Walter Hayes, a stranger to him, then connected only by the invisible thread of shared service neither man ever discussed, had handed him the keys to the old hunting cabin and told him to stay as long as he needed. He found a former addict named Nadine Price, 3 years sober, who wept openly, telling Eli about the night Walter had found her, passed out behind the gas station, and instead of calling the police had driven her to a treatment facility 2 hours away and paid for her first month out of his own pocket, then visited her every single week until she came home clean. One by one the stories piled up. A firefighter, a teacher, a mechanic, a widow, a veteran, a single mother, a recovering addict. Person after person, each with a different version of the same story, a quiet knock, an unexpected offer, a debt paid, or a hand extended by a farmer who never wanted thanks and rarely got the chance to give it before he'd already driven away. Walter never remembered most of it, not the way these people remembered it. To him, these had been small moments scattered across 40 years, easy to forget, in the daily rhythm of running a farm and living a quiet life. But to the people who'd received them, nothing about those moments had ever been small. "He changed my life," Dale had said. "He saved my family," Carla had said. "I wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for him." Frank had said, his voice breaking on the words. Eli sat with each of them, listened to each story, and felt something building inside him that went beyond gratitude, beyond even love for the old man who'd taken him in. It was closer to a calling, a realization slow and staggering that the farmer everyone in Maple Creek dismissed as a fool, the man the whole town blamed for wasting his kindness on an unworthy boy, had spent 40 years quietly planting something the town had never once bothered to notice. Not corn, not soybeans. People. Every one of them had grown in their own way from seeds Walter Hayes had planted without ever expecting to see the harvest. He'd never kept a ledger of who he'd helped or what they owed him. He'd never once in any of these stories Eli was gathering asked for anything back. And now, every single one of them, without hesitation, without a moment's doubt, said the same thing when Eli explained what had happened to Walter's farm. "What do you need from me?" By the end of the 3rd week, Eli had a list of over 60 names. Firefighters, farmers, teachers, mechanics, veterans, mothers, sons, and daughters of people Walter had helped, who were now grown and successful themselves. Business owners who remembered a farmer's quiet generosity when they were young and struggling. Each one had a story. Each one had been changed, and every single one of them agreed without a second thought to show up. The foreclosure was scheduled for the following Saturday morning. Eli made one final stop before heading back to Maple Creek, a phone call to Sheriff Doug Pruitt, the same man who'd once told Walter that the boy in his truck accident was the kid who stole from him. The same man who'd watched along with the rest of the town as Walter quietly spent his last $40 on a stranger's dinner. "I need your help," Eli said. "Not for me, for Walter." There was a pause on the line, and then Doug's voice came back, steady and certain. "Whatever you need, son. Just tell me where and when." Eli hung up the phone and looked out at the road ahead of him, the same road that would take him back to the farm, back to the old man who thought he'd lost everything, back to a town that had no idea what was about to arrive at Walter Hayes' door. For the first time in his life, Eli Ramsey wasn't running from something. He was running toward it, carrying with him the full quiet weight of everything Walter Hayes had ever planted and about to bring it home to harvest. Saturday morning arrived cold and gray, the kind of morning that felt almost cruel in how ordinary it looked, as if the sky itself hadn't gotten the memo that today Walter Hayes was going to lose everything he'd spent his life building. He stood alone on the porch of the farmhouse, dressed in his good shirt, the one he'd worn to Margaret's funeral. The only formal thing he owned, because some part of him felt that if he was going to lose the land his grandfather had cleared with his own 2 hands, he ought to at least meet the moment with dignity. 2 men from the bank pulled into the driveway just after 9, along with a county official carrying a folder of papers that would end 4 generations of the Hayes family farming this ground. Walter watched them approach, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt truly completely alone. Eli was gone. 3 weeks now without a word. Walter had stopped believing the boy was coming back. He'd told himself it was foolish to have hoped otherwise, that he'd let himself love someone who was never going to stay the way life had taught him over and over, that the things worth loving rarely lasted. The bank officer began walking toward the porch, papers in hand. Then Walter heard something in the distance. An engine. Then another. Then more than he could count. He turned toward the county road and saw the first pickup truck crest the hill above the farm. An old blue Chevy he didn't recognize, followed closely by a second, then a third. Within minutes, the quiet gravel driveway that had sat empty and grieving all morning was filling with trucks. Dozens of them, engines rumbling, dust rising off the road in a cloud that seemed to stretch back farther than Walter could see. He counted without meaning to. 1, 5, 20, 50. They kept coming. Men and women climbed down from cabs Walter had never seen before, carrying lumber tools, coils of fencing wire. A flatbed hauling a trailer of cattle pulled in behind a construction crew's truck, loaded with framing materials. Someone was directing traffic in the driveway, like it was a barn raising from 100 years ago, an image Walter had only ever seen in old photographs of his grandfather's generation. He recognized some of the faces, slowly disbelieving. Dale Kessler, the firefighter, climbing out of a truck loaded with lumber. Ruth Ann Whitmore, now in her 70s, directing a group of younger volunteers with a clipboard of her own. Marcus Bell, the mechanic, already crawling under the ruined tractor to assess what could be salvaged. Carla Jimenez, her 3 children in tow, carrying trays of food toward a folding table someone had set up near the porch. Frank Doyle, standing tall in a jacket that still bore a faded military insignia, shaking hands with strangers like old friends. None of them had brought a checkbook. Not one person carried cash. They had brought themselves. The bank officials stood frozen in the driveway, papers still in hand, watching a scene that made no sense against the quiet, defeated foreclosure they'd driven out to complete. And then through the crowd, Walter saw him. Eli walked up the driveway slowly, dust on his boots, 3 weeks of travel written across a face that looked older and steadier than it had the night he'd disappeared. In his hand, he held the keys to Walter's old truck, recovered, repaired, running again. He stopped in front of Walter on the porch steps, and for a long moment neither of them said a word. "You came back." Walter finally managed, his voice breaking on the words in a way it hadn't broken since Margaret's funeral. "I never left you," Eli said. "I just went and found everybody you helped and forgot about." He held the keys out, and Walter took them with a hand that wasn't entirely steady. "You spent $40 on me," Eli said, loud enough now that the crowd around them had gone quiet, loud enough for the bank officials to hear every word. "You spent the last cash in your wallet on a stranger who'd just wrecked your truck because you believed I was worth more than my worst mistake. Nobody had ever believed that about me before. Not one person in my whole life." He gestured out at the sea of trucks, the volunteers already unloading lumber, the crowd of people who had driven from 4 counties to stand in Walter Hayes' driveway. "Today we're here because you taught every single one of us the same thing. Some of us learned it 30 years ago. Some of us learned it 3 months ago. But every one of us learned it from you." The driveway had gone completely silent, save for the low idle of dozens of engines and the shuffle of boots against gravel. Even the bank officials' papers, still clutched uselessly in hand, seemed to understand they were witnessing something that had nothing to do with foreclosure paperwork. The senior bank officer, a man named Harold Pace, who had handled the case with the flat professional detachment of someone who'd delivered this news many times before, looked out at the crowd, then down at the papers in his hand, then back at Walter Hayes, standing on his porch surrounded by everyone he had ever quietly saved. Slowly, without a word, he folded the foreclosure notice and put it back in his folder. "Mr. Hayes," he said, clearing his throat, "I think we can find a way to work something out." Nobody cheered. Nobody shouted in triumph. This wasn't that kind of victory. It was quieter than that, deeper than that, the kind of moment that didn't need noise to be felt in every chest standing in that driveway. Word spread through Maple Creek before the sun had fully climbed. The same people who had spent weeks whispering we told him, the same neighbors who'd blamed Walter's kindness for his own ruin, began arriving throughout the day, not to gawk, but to help. Some came with quiet apologies they didn't know how to voice out loud. Most simply picked up a hammer or a shovel and got to work, standing shoulder to shoulder with the very people they'd once dismissed as beneath Walter's trust. By evening, the frame of a new barn stood against the darkening sky, not finished, not close to finished, but standing, its bones visible against the horizon like a promise being kept in real time. Walter stood at the edge of it all, Eli beside him, watching dozens of people work together on land that hours earlier he'd believed he was about to lose forever. "This isn't revenge," Eli said quietly, watching the same scene. "No," Walter agreed. "It's better than revenge." The town that had once mocked him now stood silently at his side, and no one, not Walter, not Eli, not a single soul in that driveway, needed to say another word about who had been right all along. The truth was standing right in front of them, hammer in hand, working until the sun went down. 1 year later, a new wooden sign stood at the end of the gravel driveway, carved by hand and painted by volunteers who'd shown up on a Saturday just to help with that too. Second Chance Farm. The barn had been rebuilt, bigger this time, sturdier, with a wide loft that now served as a gathering space for the young people who came through its doors every summer. Teenagers on probation. Kids the system had already written off the way Maple Creek had once written off Eli. They came for the work, the fences and the fields and the early mornings, but they stayed for something harder to name, the same quiet, unconditional belief Walter had once offered a boy in a detention center visiting room, now multiplied across dozens of young lives a year. Veterans mentored teenagers in the barn's loft on weekend afternoons, teaching skills that had nothing to do with fixing fences and everything to do with fixing what the world had broken in both of them. Families from Maple Creek and beyond volunteered together on Saturdays, the same families who had once whispered warnings about Walter's foolishness, now bringing their own children to learn what he'd spent a lifetime trying to teach. Eli managed the program full-time now, 22 years old and steadier than most men twice his age. The same careful eyes that had once looked out from behind a detention center table, now watching over a new generation of boys nobody else wanted. Walter no longer farmed alone. He hadn't, in truth, farmed alone in years, not since the day a stolen truck crashed on County Road 9 and set in motion everything that followed. Some evenings, he'd walk out to the edge of the fields at sunset, the way he always had, and watch the light fall gold across land that had nearly been taken from him twice, once by a tornado, once by a debt no insurance could cover, and saved both times by something no bank could have ever measured. Children's laughter carried across fields that had once known only silence. Walter would stand there a long while, taking it in, and sometimes quietly, to no one but himself, he'd say the only thing that ever made sense of it all. "Turns out, people are the only crop worth growing." Then he'd turn back toward this house, toward the porch light Eli always left burning for him, and walk home. Somewhere in your life there was probably one person who believed in you when you didn't believe in yourself. Maybe it was a parent, a teacher, a grandparent, or perhaps even a stranger you'll never see again, someone who showed up for you once briefly and then disappeared from your life without ever knowing how much it mattered. Walter Hayes spent $40 that night on a boy who had just stolen his truck. But what he was really giving away wasn't money, it was hope. And hope, it turns out, has a remarkable way of finding its way back home sometimes, in the form of a single boy walking back up a driveway. Sometimes in the form of 60 trucks arriving when you least expect them. Sometimes simply in the quiet decision to believe someone is worth more than their worst mistake. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Who gave you your second chance? Share your story in the comments below. Someone reading it today might discover the courage they've been searching for, the courage to believe that it's not too late to become the person someone else once believed they could be. And if you believe kindness is still stronger than hate, consider sharing this story with someone who needs a reminder that one small act of compassion can echo for generations. Until next time, take care of yourself and never underestimate the quiet power of choosing kindness when the world expects revenge.